If you've spent any time in the Bible, you've probably noticed that for some reason, God keeps on changing. So, yeah, we should probably take some time to talk about that one. Hey Internet, my name is Jeff and I'm a pastor, and today we're going to talk about the fact that when you read through the Bible, God seems to keep on changing. So let me give you just one example of this. I work with a pastor named Kelly Lynn at Benson Memorial United Methodist Church, and Kelly Lynn and I decided that we were going to preach our way through the entire book of Genesis. For some reason, we thought this would be a good idea. It actually turned out pretty great, but anyway, that's beside the point. One night I was preaching from the beginning of Genesis chapter 18. And at the beginning of Genesis chapter 18, God is talking to Abraham, who God made this promise to. And the entire message of this passage seems to be that God doesn't change, and that his promises don't change. And when God makes a promise to someone, God always comes through. Well, after the sermon was over, Kelly Lynn came up to me and she was like, "Yeah, that was a good service, really good sermon. Thanks for that, though, because next week I need to talk about how God changes God's mind." Because get this, the second part of Genesis 18 is about God changing God's mind. He's about to wipe out the city of Sodom, and Abraham says to God, "Hey, if I can find, I think he starts off with 50. If I could find 50 righteous people in the city, you're not going to wipe it out, right?" And God says, "Okay, fine. If you can find 50, I won't wipe out Sodom." And then Abraham says, "All right, what about 30? And he eventually bargains God down to 1. If he can find one person in Sodom, he won't wipe out the city. So God seems to be changing God's mind about Sodom during the course of this passage, and the passage right before it seems to say that God never changes God's mind. So, side by side, you have these two very different representations of who God is. You also find it in just the first 2 chapters of Genesis, therefore the first 2 chapters of the Bible. You find that when God is creating the earth, God seems to speak it into existence, and there's a lot of power displayed on behalf of God. But then when you look at Genesis chapter 2, you find that when God is creating human beings, God gets God's fingernails dirty, digging in dirt and forming people out of the dirt and the dust. So which is it? Is it the mighty God who speaks everything into existence, or the God who gets dirty? For another example of this, and maybe a shocking one, take a look at Job chapter 1. Because God is portrayed as sitting around with God's board of directors in order to make decisions. And apparently Satan has a seat on God's board of directors. That just doesn't jive with a lot of passages like, say, Psalm 2, where God has all the authority and all of the power and all of the sovereignty in the universe. So which is it? God answers to a board of directors, or God has all the power and sovereignty in the universe? There are really 2 things that I want to say about these sort of inconsistencies, or these different portrayals of who God is. And one is, and I don't want to belabor this one because I already made a video about this, something like why are there contradictions in the Bible? I'll link it in the description. But one is that different images for God are going to resonate with different people. So whenever you find inconsistencies or different images that are trying to portray the same thing in the Bible, that's not a threat. That's actually a good thing. That's not something we have to fix. It's something we should celebrate, because different images are going to resonate with different people for different reasons in different circumstances. But yeah, for more on that, watch my video about the contradictions that are in the Bible. But the second thing that I want to say, and this is particularly with regards to the changing images of God and why God seems to keep on changing in the Bible. The second thing I'll say is that the Bible doesn't give us a consistent and uniform understanding of who God is, but an evolving understanding of who God is. The Bible was written by a lot of different people. I've said it before, we don't even know how many people are responsible for the written material in the Bible. It's written by a lot of different people over the course of centuries. And so, of course, in all of that time and in all of those circumstances with all of those different people, there are just going to be different understandings of God. But what's especially cool about this, and what I really love about the fact that the Bible gives us an evolving rather than a uniform understanding of who God is that we get to trace how people thought about God in all of these different circumstances, and we get to see the consequences of those understandings of God. So here's what I mean. Throughout the course of Scripture, we find the people of God in slavery and in exile and being wiped out by other nations. But then we also find the people of God having all sorts of power, and in fact, power that they exploit sometimes. And we get to see how these people understood God when they were in power versus when they didn't have any power at all. And that is going to tell us something very interesting. And I think that one of the most poignant things, especially if you're watching this maybe as an American, and maybe as an American who belongs to a particular political party that claims that God is on its side. In fact, both parties kind of claim this at different times, and people without parties claim this at different times as well. Everybody seems to be operating on the assumption that God is on our side. But what's fascinating about this is that when you look at books like Joshua and the Book of Judges, you find that when the people of God have power, and they assume that God is on their side, and they assume that God is just going to destroy all of their enemies, and in fact calls them to wipe out their enemies, it actually leads to disaster. So yeah, that image of God as like protector and the God who's on our side, it's a very powerful and liberating thing for people who are slaves or maybe people who are in exile, but it's a dangerous thing to assume when you have power and you think that God is giving you the go-ahead to exploit that power. Or another poignant example might be those passages where God seems to be especially angry and vengeful. When the people of God were in exile, or when the people of God were slaves in Egypt, they needed that image. They needed that image to hold on to, and they needed that image to empower them, and it did, in fact, empower them. And in some cases, brought them hope. But I've also seen these images of an angry, vengeful God lead to a lot of anxiety for people and actually kind of destroy their faith. But if we look at the Bible and we remember that it doesn't give us a consistent view of God, but an evolving understanding of God for different people in different circumstances, that's when we can start to have a little bit of perspective about what these images are and what they communicate to different people in different circumstances. So that's it. That's why the Bible has seemingly inconsistent understandings of who God is and why God seems to change throughout Scripture, or why God is portrayed differently throughout Scripture. If this video has been helpful for you, give it a like down below, the little thumbs up button right there. You can hit subscribe if you want to see more of my videos in the future, and you can click the bell to get an alert right there on your phone whenever I post a new video, but they usually come out on Tuesday mornings. And again, be sure to check out my video about the contradictions in the Bible. Again, I'll put the link in the description, if I remember to. I really hope I remember to do that. Anyway, grace and peace, everybody.